Every single afternoon, the quiet girl would appear in the dusty corner of his library, surrounded by books she never opened. She stayed for hours, head bent, silent. Then, one snowy evening, she left abruptly, forgetting something small. Curious and worried, the old librarian followed her out into the storm, and the heartbreaking truth he discovered changed both their lives forever. What secret could this mysterious library girl be hiding? Tell us where you're watching from. Give this video a thumbs up if you're already hooked, and subscribe so you don't miss the emotional reveal. Let's settle into the quiet aisles of the Westbrook Public Library. The Westbrook Public Library wasn't merely a building to Arthur Harrison. It was a living entity, breathing with the scent of aging paper, bound stories, and the quiet aspirations of its patrons. He adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles, the thick lenses magnifying the familiar spines lining the towering oak shelves. Through the tall, arched windows, a hallmark of the building's sturdy 19th-century origins, the late afternoon sun cast long, golden shafts of light, illuminating the swirling universe of dust motes dancing in the otherwise hushed, cathedral-like. Here for 35 years, Arthur had been the custodian of this quiet world, a responsibility he cherished more deeply than almost anything else. Nestled on a corner in the older part of Westbrook, Maine, a coastal city bracing for the coming chill of a northern autumn, the library stood as a steadfast brick sentinel. Its neighbors were the practical workaday establishments of the community. Mrs. O'Malley's perpetually steamy laundromat on one side, Henderson's hardware with its comforting smell of sawdust and oil on the other. The library offered a different kind of necessity, sustenance for the mind and spirit. Its grand oak doors, heavy and reassuring, opened into a space filled with the low hum of whispered pages turning, the soft click-clack of computer keyboards, and the pervasive, unique perfume of knowledge and time. Worn leather armchairs, cracked and softened with age, invited lingering in quiet corners, while the massive wooden circulation desk, Arthur's command post, stood solid and welcoming near the entrance. Arthur himself, a man whose quiet demeanor and slightly stooped posture seemed to blend seamlessly with the venerable surroundings, moved through the aisles with a familiar shuffling gait. At 68, his thinning hair was the color of pewter, meticulously combed, and his kind blue eyes, magnified behind his spectacles, held the observant calm of someone who had spent a lifetime watching and listening. His uniform was unchanging: soft corduroy trousers, a button-down shirt, usually plaid or checked, and a rotation of well-loved wool cardigans, often with slightly frayed cuffs. He possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of the library's collection, an internal Dewey Decimal System honed over decades, capable of retrieving an obscure volume of poetry or recommending the perfect historical novel with uncanny accuracy. He knew his regulars intimately. Mrs. Gable, whose eyesight was failing, required her large-print mysteries set aside each Tuesday. Professor Abernathy from the local community college needed absolute silence when researching his monographs on migratory birds. Young mother Sarah Jenkins relied on the Wednesday morning story hour to give her a brief respite, while her toddler twins were momentarily captivated. Arthur facilitated these small rituals, these quiet quests for information or escape, with gentle efficiency. Since his wife Eleanor had passed away from cancer 3 years prior, the library, its routines, and its patrons had become the essential scaffolding of his solitary life. His son, Michael, lived across the country in California, immersed in his own busy life. Their phone calls were warm but infrequent. The library, therefore, was Arthur's anchor, his purpose. It was sometime in late September, when the first crimson leaves began to appear on the maple tree outside the main reading room window, that Arthur became consciously aware of the girl. She wasn't entirely new. He had a fleeting memory of her, perhaps browsing the young adult paperbacks briefly during the summer, but her pattern now was different, distinct, and puzzling. She arrived like clockwork each weekday afternoon, usually around 3:30, just as the initial after-school rush of louder teenagers began to subside. She slipped through the heavy oak doors with a quietness that bordered on invisibility, her small frame almost lost in the faded purple jacket she wore regardless of the weather. Her straight nut-brown hair often fell like a curtain across her face, shielding her expression, A plain, slightly grimy backpack, looking disproportionately large for her slight build, was always slung over one shoulder. Her routine, once noticed, was unvarying and peculiar. She bypassed the bustling children's section with its colourful displays and inviting beanbag chairs. She ignored the bank of public computers, where other students checked social media or played games. She didn't pause at the new arrivals shelf or scan the magazine rack. Her path was always direct, unerring, leading her to the far back corner of the main reading room. This corner was a quiet eddy in the library's gentle current, dominated by shelves holding less frequented sections, poetry anthologies, biographies of obscure historical figures, philosophical treatises. It offered a degree of seclusion. In the center stood a sturdy, slightly lopsided oak table surrounded by 4 unupholstered wooden chairs. The girl always chose the same chair, the one facing the wall, its back to the rest of the room. It was a defensive posture, Arthur noted, the posture of someone wishing not to be seen or disturbed. Once seated, she would carefully slide the heavy backpack off her shoulder, placing it on the floor beside her chair, close enough to touch. Then the ritual would vary slightly. Some afternoons she would pull out a worn spiral notebook and a single pencil, the lead worn down almost to the wood. She would hunch over the notebook, her head bent low, writing or drawing with intense concentration for long periods. Her non-writing arm curled protectively around the page, shielding it from view. Her pencil movements were small, precise, almost secretive. On other afternoons, she wouldn't produce the notebook at all. She would simply sit there, resting her chin in her hand, her gaze fixed blankly on the textured plaster of the wall in front of her, or sometimes turned towards the tall window overlooking the small city park across the street. Her stillness on those days was profound, almost unnerving. She wasn't reading the spines of the books surrounding her. She seemed utterly lost in her own internal landscape, her young face holding a quiet sadness or worry that tugged at Arthur's heart. She never made a sound, never coughed, never fidgeted excessively, never sighed audibly. She never once approached the circulation desk to ask a question, never browsed the shelves within arm's reach, never made eye contact with other patrons who might wander into her corner. She simply existed in that space, a silent, enigmatic presence for 2, sometimes nearly 3 hours. Then, just as reliably, usually between 6:15 and 6:30, as the library began its quiet winding down towards the 7 o'clock closing time, she would stir. If the notebook was out, she would carefully close it, tuck it deep inside her backpack along with the worn pencil. She would meticulously zip the bag shut, sling it over her shoulder, push her chair quietly back under the table, and slip out of the library as silently and unobtrusively as she had arrived, melting into the evening twilight. Arthur, observing this unwavering routine from his perch behind the circulation desk, found his librarian's instinct for order subtly disturbed, and his human curiosity deeply piqued. He mentally scanned the library's patrons, trying to place her. Was she one of the Thompson kids from Maple Street? Or perhaps related to the Millers who lived above the bakery? No, she didn't resemble any of the families he knew, even vaguely. He mentally dubbed her Eliza, after a character in a favorite 19th century novel, a quiet observer on the fringes of life. Who was this girl? Why the library, if not for books? Was it simply a warm, safe place to pass the time between school and, what? A home where no one was waiting? An obligation she dreaded? The questions multiplied with each passing day. He felt a growing urge to break the silence, to offer a gentle, "Everything all right, dear?" or "Can I help you find anything?" But her deliberate self-containment, the almost palpable do not disturb field she projected, held him back. He sensed instinctively that intrusion, however well meant, would shatter the fragile sanctuary she had found or created in his library's quietest corner. He did mention her again, more pointedly this time, to Carol, his cheerful part-time assistant, during a lull between patrons. "Carol, that girl, Eliza, the one who sits in the back? Have you ever spoken to her? Does she ever ask for anything?" Carol paused her shelving cart, frowning in thought. "Eliza? Oh, the quiet one. No, never says a word. Just sits. I kinda assumed she was maybe waiting for her mum to get off work or something." Doesn't seem to bother anyone, she shrugged. Maybe she just likes the quiet. Perhaps, Arthur murmured, though he suspected it was more complex than that. Liking the quiet was one thing. Sitting rigidly for hours, surrounded by books, yet completely ignoring them, suggested something else entirely. He began to observe more closely, noting the small details. The way her purple jacket, though clean, was thin and worn at the elbows, likely inadequate for the biting Maine winters that were fast approaching. The state of her sneakers, the rubber sole peeling away slightly near the toe on one shoe. The way she sometimes rubbed her arms as if chilled, even inside the heated library. The absence of any snacks or drinks ever emerging from the backpack. Except for that one time, he saw her quickly eat a small, plain sandwich, hiding it behind her notebook as if ashamed. He saw the weariness that sometimes settled on her young face, the way she'd rub her eyes or rest her head on the table for a moment before straightening up again, always watchful. He saw the way her shoulders would tense if the library grew suddenly noisy, or if someone lingered too near her table. She seemed to carry a weight far heavier than her backpack. As autumn deepened into November, bringing colder winds and the first threats of snow, Eliza's presence became even more ingrained in Arthur's daily landscape. Her arrival at 3:30, her silent vigil in the corner, her departure around 6:30. It was as predictable as the setting sun. The mystery of her purpose there only deepened, solidifying into a quiet ache of concern in Arthur's chest. He just hoped she was safe, wherever she went after leaving the sanctuary of his library each evening. The weeks marched relentlessly towards the deep freeze of a Maine winter. Outside the library's tall windows, the vibrant autumn leaves were replaced by bare skeletal branches, often laced with frost in the mornings. Snow flurries became more frequent, sometimes dusting the sidewalks, other times swirling in gusty winds that rattled the old window panes. Inside, the library offered a warm, quiet respite, the hiss of the radiators a comforting counterpoint to the howl of the wind. Eliza's routine, however, remained stubbornly consistent, almost defiant of the changing weather. Each afternoon around 3:30, the heavy oak door would swing open, and she would slip inside, a small figure bundled against the cold. Her faded purple jacket now seemed woefully inadequate. Arthur noticed she often wore thin, knitted gloves, with holes in the fingers and no hat, her straight brown hair collecting snowflakes that quickly melted as she made her beeline for the back corner. She still carried the same worn backpack, perhaps even heavier now, Arthur thought, weighed down by winter layers or extra schoolbooks. Her destination remained the lopsided oak table facing the wall. She'd shed her damp jacket, hang it carefully on the back of her chair, sit and retrieve her spiral notebook and pencil, or sometimes just stare, lost in whatever private world claimed her thoughts. Arthur found himself watching her even more closely now, his quiet concern growing into a low hum of worry. He noticed she seemed paler, thinner than when she first started coming. There were often dark smudges of fatigue beneath her young eyes. On particularly cold days, he saw her tuck her hands into her sleeves or rub them together, her fingers likely stiff from the walk to the library. He started making a point of ensuring the heat was turned up a little higher in the back reading room, positioning a small portable electric heater, ostensibly for general patron comfort, closer to her usual corner before she arrived each day. He didn't know if she noticed, or if it made much difference against the drafts from the old windows, but it was a small, anonymous gesture he could make. He also began paying more attention to the notebook she sometimes wrote or drew in so intently. From his vantage point at the circulation desk, especially during quieter periods, he could occasionally catch glimpses when she shifted or turned a page, though she remained fiercely protective of its contents. He saw glimpses of careful handwriting, small detailed drawings, flowers, sometimes animals, once what looked like the intricate pattern of a snowflake. But often he noticed her simply staring at a blank page for long stretches, pencil hovering, brow furrowed in concentration, or perhaps frustration. Was it homework she struggled with, or something else entirely? One blustery afternoon, Mrs. Gable, collecting her weekly stack of large print mysteries, paused at the circulation desk, adjusting her scarf. "That poor little thing back there," she murmured, nodding discreetly towards Eliza's corner. Comes in every day, regular as clockwork. Sits all alone. Doesn't she have anywhere warmer to go? Arthur felt a familiar pang of protectiveness. She seems to appreciate the quiet here, Mrs. Gable, he replied evenly. Lots of students use the library to study after school. Study? Mrs. Gable peered over her spectacles towards the back corner. Doesn't look like studying to me. Looks more like waiting or hiding, she sighed. Breaks my heart to see a child looking so serious all the time. Doesn't seem right. She gathered her books. Well, you take care, Arthur. Don't let this old building get too drafty. Mrs. Gable's words echoed Arthur's own unspoken fears. Waiting, hiding. Was that what Eliza was doing? Waiting for a parent who worked late? Hiding from something or someone at home? The possibilities troubled him deeply. A small incident a few days later heightened his concern. Eliza was packing her backpack, getting ready to leave as the 6:30 closing announcement neared. As she stood up, her elbow bumped the lopsided table, jostling its surface. Her worn pencil rolled off the edge and onto the floor, landing near the leg of a nearby empty chair. She froze, her eyes darting around quickly to see if anyone had noticed. Arthur, who had been shelving books nearby, saw the small mishap. Thinking nothing of it, he bent down, picked up the pencil, and took a step towards her, holding it out with a gentle smile. "Dropped this," he said softly. Eliza flinched back as if he'd startled a wild creature. Her eyes widened with what looked like genuine fear, and she snatched the pencil from his hand without a word, her knuckles white. She quickly shoved it into her backpack, zipped it aggressively, slung the bag over her shoulder, and practically ran out of the library, ignoring Arthur's quiet, surprised, "You're welcome." Arthur stood there feeling slightly stunned. It was just a pencil. His offer to help had been reflexive, automatic. But her reaction, the sudden fear, the panicked flight, was completely disproportionate. Why would such a small, normal interaction frighten her so badly? Was she afraid of librarians, of adults in general? Or was there something specific about him, about being noticed, that terrified her? The incident left him deeply unsettled. He replayed it in his mind, searching for something he might have done wrong. Had his smile seemed menacing? Had his approach been too sudden? Or was her fear rooted in something entirely separate from him, some past experience that made any unexpected approach from an adult feel threatening? He became even more cautious around her after that, ensuring he gave her a wide berth when shelving books in her corner, avoiding direct eye contact unless absolutely necessary, keeping his greetings, if their paths crossed near the entrance, brief and neutral. He didn't want to frighten her again, but the image of her wide, fearful eyes haunted him. He started noticing other small details. Sometimes, before settling down with her notebook, Eliza would pull out a much smaller, brightly colored backpack, the kind a kindergartner might carry, from inside her own larger, worn one. She would place this smaller bag carefully on the chair beside her, occasionally glancing towards it, before focusing on her notebook. What was in the little bag? Why bring it if she never opened it there? Was it for a younger sibling? One particularly cold afternoon, Eliza arrived looking utterly exhausted. Her cheeks were flushed, not from the cold, but seemingly from fever. She coughed intermittently, a dry hacking sound she tried to muffle in her sleeve. She huddled in her usual chair, pulling her thin jacket tighter around herself, but didn't even take out her notebook. She just sat there, shivering slightly, resting her head on the table, her eyes closed. Arthur watched her from the desk, his worry escalating sharply. She was clearly unwell. Sitting for hours in a drafty library corner was the last thing she should be doing. He felt a strong urge to go over, to ask if she needed help, to offer her a warm drink, perhaps even call someone for her. But the memory of her fearful reaction to the pencil incident held him back. He didn't want to scare her, especially not when she was feeling ill. He compromised. He quietly made a cup of hot herbal tea, chamomile, something soothing, from the small stash he kept for himself in the staff break room. He put it in a disposable paper cup, placed it on a small tray with a couple of packaged crackers, and walked casually towards the back of the reading room, pretending to check the shelves. He placed the tray gently on the edge of Eliza's table, careful not to startle her. "Thought you might like something warm," he murmured softly, not looking directly at her, keeping his voice low and non-threatening. "Feeling a bit under the weather today?" Eliza's head snapped up, her eyes wide and wary. She stared at the steaming cup, then at Arthur, suspicion warring with what looked like surprise. She didn't speak, just watched him cautiously. "It's just chamomile tea," Arthur added gently. "Sometimes helps with a cough. Crackers too if you're hungry." He didn't wait for a response, just gave a small nod and walked away, retreating back to the safety of his circulation desk, feeling her eyes following him. He didn't look back immediately. He busied himself with paperwork, his heart pounding slightly. Had he done the right thing, or had he crossed the line again? He risked a discreet glance towards the back corner a few minutes later. Eliza was still sitting there, but the tray was closer to her now. As he watched, she hesitantly reached out a small hand, wrapped her cold fingers around the warm paper cup, and lifted it slowly towards her lips, blowing gently on the steam before taking a tentative sip. A small measure of warmth spread through Arthur's own chest. She hadn't rejected the offering. It was another tiny victory, another fragile moment of connection, but it also solidified his worry. She was sick, likely should be home in bed, yet here she was, alone in the library. Why? The unanswered question hung heavy in the quiet, book-filled air. December arrived in Westbrook, Maine with a vengeance, bringing steel-grey skies, biting winds that howled off the Atlantic, and the first significant snowfall of the season. Thick, heavy flakes began drifting down mid-afternoon, blanketing the city in a layer of white that quickly turned sidewalks treacherous and roads slushy. Inside the library, the radiators hissed and clanked, fighting a losing battle against the drafts seeping through the old window frames. Patrons hurried in, shaking snow from their coats, their faces ruddy from the cold, seeking refuge in the building's warm, quiet embrace. Arthur watched the snow accumulating outside, a growing unease settling over him. He scanned the reading room, his gaze inevitably drawn to the back corner. Eliza was there in her usual spot, hunched over her notebook. She'd arrived just before the snow started in earnest, her purple jacket dusted with white flakes, her worn sneakers already looking damp. She seemed even quieter than usual today, more withdrawn, her focus on her notebook absolute. As the afternoon wore on, the snowfall intensified, transforming from gentle flakes into a driving blizzard. The wind howled, rattling the tall windows, and the light outside dimmed prematurely, casting long, eerie shadows within the library. Fewer patrons braved the storm. The usual after-school crowd was noticeably absent. The library grew quieter, the silence broken only by the wind, the hiss of the radiators, and the soft rustle of pages from the few dedicated readers who remained. Arthur kept a worried eye on Eliza. She hadn't moved for nearly 2 hours, her head bent low, her pencil flying across the page of her notebook with fierce concentration. She seemed completely oblivious to the worsening storm outside. Did she have a safe way home? Did she even realize how bad the weather was getting? He checked the clock. It was nearing 6 p.m. Usually she started packing up around this time. He considered making an announcement about the storm, suggesting patrons might want to head home before travel became impossible, but he hesitated. He didn't want to single Eliza out, or make her feel pressured to leave if the library was her only warm refuge. At 6:15, Eliza finally stirred. She closed her notebook, stretched her stiff shoulders, and began slowly packing her backpack. Arthur watched her movements, noting the weariness in her posture. She zipped the bag, slung it over her shoulder, pulled on her thin, damp jacket, and stood up. Just as she turned to leave, a particularly violent gust of wind slammed against the tall windows, rattling the glass ominously. The lights flickered overhead for a heart-stopping moment before steadying again. The sudden noise and flickering lights clearly startled Eliza. She jumped, her head whipping around, eyes wide with alarm. In her haste to leave, perhaps unnerved by the storm's intensity, she fumbled slightly as she pushed her chair back under the table. Then she hurried towards the front entrance, her steps quick and anxious, almost a run. She pushed through the heavy oak doors and disappeared into the swirling white chaos outside without a backward glance. Arthur watched her go, a deep sense of foreboding settling over him. The storm was genuinely bad now, visibility dropping rapidly. The streets would be icy, the wind brutal. He pictured her slight figure struggling against the blizzard in that thin jacket and worn sneakers. Where was she going? Did she live far? Would she make it home safely? He walked towards the back corner, intending to tidy up as usual before closing. As he approached Eliza's table, his eyes fell upon something lying on the floor beside the chair she had occupied. It was a small, brightly colored mitten, clearly handmade, knitted from cheerful yellow yarn, now slightly damp from melted snow. It must have fallen from her pocket or backpack when she jumped at the gust of wind and rushed out. Arthur bent down and picked it up. It was child-sized, small enough perhaps for a 5- or 6-year-old. It wasn't Eliza's. He remembered her own gloves were thin, grey and fingerless. This mitten belonged to someone else. Perhaps it belonged to the owner of the small, brightly coloured backpack he sometimes saw her carrying. A younger sibling. He held the small, soft mitten in his hand. It felt warm, imbued with a residual trace of the child who had worn it. He looked towards the front doors, now obscured by the swirling snow outside. Eliza was out there, alone, heading into the teeth of a blizzard, and she had forgotten this small, important item. A wave of worry, stronger than any he had felt before, washed over Arthur. This wasn't just idle concern anymore. It was a visceral fear for the girl's safety, and perhaps for the safety of whoever the mitten belonged to. He couldn't simply lock up the library and go home to his quiet apartment, wondering all night if she had made it through the storm. He thought of the fear in her eyes when he'd handed her the pencil, her paleness when she was sick, her solitary vigil day after day. He thought of the responsibility he felt, not just as a librarian, but as a fellow human being. He looked at the clock. 6:35. He still had 25 minutes before official closing time. Carol, his assistant, wasn't due in tonight. He was alone in the library, save for one elderly gentleman dozing in an armchair near the fireplace. He made a decision. It felt impulsive, perhaps foolish, potentially intrusive, but overwhelmingly necessary. He grabbed his own heavy wool coat, scarf and hat from the small staff closet behind the circulation desk. He carefully placed the yellow mitten in his deep coat pocket. He walked over to the dozing patron. "Mr. Henderson," he said gently, "the storm's getting quite bad out there. I need to step out for a moment, but I'll have to lock the main doors. Behind me for security. Are you all right to wait here until I return? Shouldn't be too long." Mr. Henderson blinked awake, looking momentarily confused. "Oh? Storm, is it? Yes, quite all right, Arthur. Don't mind me. Just resting my eyes." "Thank you," Arthur said. He hurried to the front entrance, pulled the heavy door open against the force of the wind, and stepped out into the swirling blizzard. The cold bit instantly at his face, and the wind snatched at his scarf. Visibility was poor, the streetlights casting hazy halos in the thick driving snow. He peered down the street in the direction Eliza usually headed. He could just make out a small, lone figure trudging through the deepening snowdrifts about half a block ahead, head bent against the wind, the faded purple of her jacket a dim splash of color against the white landscape. It had to be her. Heart-pounding, pulling his hat down lower over his ears, Arthur Harrison, the quiet librarian who rarely ventured beyond his predictable routines, began to follow the mysterious girl out into the worsening storm, the small yellow mitten clutched tightly in his pocket, needing to know where she was going, needing to know she was safe. The blizzard raged around Arthur Harrison with a ferocity that stole his breath and stung his eyes. Snow swirled thick and fast, reducing visibility to mere yards, plastering itself against his glasses, despite his attempts to shield his face with a gloved hand. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, cutting through the layers of his heavy wool coat, finding every small gap, chilling him to the bone. Each step was a struggle through the rapidly accumulating drifts that already reached halfway up his calves, his usual shuffling gait replaced by a laborious, high-stepping trudge. He kept his eyes fixed on the small, determined figure battling, the elements half a block ahead. Eliza. She moved slowly, head bent low against the driving snow, her slight frame buffeted by the powerful gusts of wind. Her faded purple jacket offered scant protection against the biting cold. Arthur's heart ached watching her solitary struggle. How far did she have to go like this? He quickened his own pace, driven by a sense of urgency, closing the distance between them slightly, but careful not to get too close, not wanting to alarm her. He just needed to keep her in sight, to see where she was heading. The usual landmarks of the neighborhood, familiar houses, corner stores, parked cars, were transformed into indistinct white mounds, the streetlights casting eerie, diffused halos in the swirling snow. It felt like navigating an alien landscape. He followed her as she turned off the main street onto a narrower residential road, Maple Avenue. The houses here were smaller, closer together, mostly older clapboard. Homes common in this part of Westbrook. Fewer streetlights penetrated the gloom here, and the sidewalks were even less shoveled, forcing both Eliza and Arthur to walk in the tire tracks left by the few cars that had braved the storm earlier. As he trudged onward, Arthur noticed Eliza, kept glancing nervously over her shoulder. Was she aware of him? He deliberately slowed his pace slightly, letting the distance increase again, trying to appear like just another person caught out in the storm, though few others were foolish enough to be walking. Her glances seemed less directed at him specifically, however, and more like a general ingrained habit of watchfulness, scanning the swirling snow behind her, as if checking for threats. It added another layer to the mystery, another pang of worry in Arthur's chest. What was she afraid of out here besides the storm itself? She continued for another 2 blocks down Maple Avenue, her small figure a lonely silhouette against the white fury. Then, she turned abruptly up the short walkway of one of the smallest houses on the block. A modest, slightly dilapidated 2-story home, badly in need of a coat of paint, its porch railing askew. Unlike its neighbors, no warm lights glowed invitingly in the downstairs windows here. The house looked dark, cold, almost deserted, except for a single dim light visible through an upstairs window curtain. Eliza didn't fumble for keys. She reached under a loose porch board, a hiding spot Arthur could just make out through the snow, retrieved something small and quickly unlocked the front door, slipping inside and closing it firmly behind her, vanishing from view. Arthur stopped at the sidewalk across the street, partially sheltered by the snow-laden branches of a large pine tree, catching his breath, his lungs aching from the cold air. So this was her destination. Not a warm, welcoming home bustling with family, but this quiet, dark, seemingly neglected house. Why come here instead of staying in the warm library until the storm passed? He stood there for several minutes, uncertain what to do next. He had followed her. He knew where she had gone. She was inside, presumably safe from the blizzard itself, though the house didn't look particularly inviting. His initial mission, ensuring she got through the storm, felt partially accomplished. He should probably just turn around, head back to the library, lock up properly, and go home to his warm apartment. But he couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The darkness of the house, her solitary arrival, the way she retrieved a hidden key, it didn't feel right. And then there was the mitten, the small yellow hand-knitted mitten still tucked safely in his coat pocket. It felt like unfinished business, a tangible piece of the puzzle he still needed to place. He thought about simply knocking on the door again, returning the mitten, asking if everything was all right. But remembering Eliza's panicked reaction in the library, he hesitated. He didn't want to frighten her further, especially not here, in what was presumably her home turf, however unwelcoming it appeared. As he stood there, indecisive, shivering, slightly despite his heavy coat, the dim light in the upstairs window caught his eye again. He thought he saw movement behind the thin curtain, a shadow passing small silhouettes. Was someone else inside? Was she not alone after all? Then he heard it. Faintly at first, carried on the howling wind, but unmistakable. The sound of a child crying. Not the loud, demanding wail of an infant, but the softer, more persistent, distressed sobs of a young child who was perhaps sick, or scared, or lonely. The sound cut through Arthur's hesitation like a knife. It wasn't Eliza crying. The sound seemed younger, higher pitched. It had to be the owner of the yellow mitten. And Eliza was in there, perhaps trying to comfort the crying child, alone in this cold, dark house. He couldn't walk away now, whatever. The situation was, whatever boundaries he might be crossing, the sound of that distressed child settled the matter. He crossed the snow-covered street, his boots crunching softly, and walked up the short path to the front porch where Eliza had disappeared moments before. He stood before the slightly battered front door, the paint peeling, a small crack visible in one of the glass panels. He took a deep breath, the cold air stinging his lungs, and raised his hand to knock again, louder this time, more insistent. "Eliza," he called out, raising his voice to be heard over the wind and the faint, persistent sound of the child crying from within. "Eliza, it's Mr. Harrison from the library. Are you all right in there? Is there someone who needs help?" He waited, listening intently. The crying inside seemed to falter slightly, replaced by muffled whispers. Then, after a long moment, he heard slow, hesitant footsteps approaching the door from the inside. The lock clicked, and the door opened a few inches. Eliza peered out at him, her face pale in the dim porch light filtering through the swirling snow. Her eyes were wide, not with the panicked fear he'd seen earlier, but with a mixture of surprise, exhaustion, and wary apprehension. She clutched the edge of the door as if ready to slam it shut. "Mr. Harrison," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. What are you doing here?" "You forgot this," Arthur said gently, pulling the small yellow mitten from his pocket and holding it out to her. "At the library, I was worried about you getting home in this storm, and about whoever this belongs to." Eliza stared at the mitten in his hand, her expression shifting from wariness to something else, recognition and a dawning understanding, quickly followed by a flush of what looked like embarrassment, maybe even shame. She didn't take the mitten immediately. From behind her, inside the house, the sound of the child crying escalated into a more distressed series of coughs and sobs. "Mama? Liza? Cold?" a small voice wailed pitifully. Eliza visibly flinched at the sound, her gaze darting back into the dark hallway behind her, then back to Arthur standing on the porch, snow collecting on his hat and shoulders. Her carefully constructed walls of reserve seemed to crumble under the weight of the storm, the crying child, and Arthur's unexpected presence. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling now, no longer wary but pleading. She opened the door, wider. "Please, can you help? I don't know what else to do." Arthur didn't hesitate. He stepped quickly out of the blizzard and into the cold, dim hallway of the little house, the door closing behind him, shutting out the storm, but opening onto a reality far more heartbreaking than he could have imagined. The mystery of the library. Girl was about to be revealed. Arthur stepped over the threshold, pulling the front door shut against the howling wind and swirling snow. The immediate chill inside the small house was almost as biting as the blizzard outside. A single bare bulb, hanging from a frayed wire in the hallway ceiling, cast a weak yellow light, revealing peeling wallpaper, worn floorboards, and an air of neglect overlaid with a child's desperate attempt at tidiness. The only heat seemed to emanate faintly from a small, ancient-looking space heater, plugged into an outlet in the dim living room he glimpsed off the hall, clearly inadequate against the December cold. The sound of the child's distressed coughing and crying echoed from the upper floor. Eliza stood before him, trembling slightly, clutching her thin purple jacket around herself. Her face, pale and smudged with fatigue in the dim light, was awash with conflicting emotions, fear, exhaustion, embarrassment, and a desperate plea for help. The defensive mask she wore so carefully at the library was gone, revealing the vulnerable child beneath. "He won't stop coughing," Eliza whispered, her voice cracking. "My brother, Mikey. He's only 6. He's been sick for days, but tonight he's burning up, and his breathing sounds funny. Mom's working a double shift at the diner over in South Portland tonight because Mrs. Henderson called out sick. Her phone's probably off while she's working, or maybe the battery died. I tried calling her neighbor, Mrs. Gable, but there's no answer. Maybe she's stuck somewhere in the storm too. I didn't know who else to call." Her explanation tumbled out in a rush, confirming Arthur's worst fears. She wasn't just waiting or hiding at the library. She was shouldering an impossible burden, caring for a seriously ill younger brother alone because their mother had to work. "Okay, Eliza, okay," Arthur said, keeping his voice calm and reassuring, though his own heart ached with empathy and concern. He gently took the yellow mitten from his pocket and handed it to her. "This is Mikey's, I assume." She nodded, clutching the mitten tightly. "He dropped it getting off the school bus yesterday. I was going to fix the loose thread." Her lower lip trembled. "He loves these mittens. Grandma knitted them before she—" She trailed off, fresh tears welling. "Let's go see Mikey now," Arthur said gently but firmly. "Show me the way." Eliza nodded again and led him quickly up the narrow, creaking staircase. The upstairs hallway was even colder than downstairs. She pushed open a bedroom door, revealing a small room sparsely furnished with 2 twin beds. In one bed, buried under a thin collection of blankets, lay a small boy, his face flushed crimson with fever, his small chest rising and falling rapidly. With shallow, rattling breaths, he coughed weakly, a sound thick with congestion followed by a distressed whimper. This was Mikey, the owner of the yellow mitten. Arthur, leaning on decades of quiet observation and common sense rather than medical training, could see immediately the boy was seriously ill. The labored breathing, the high fever apparent even from across the room, the listlessness, it screamed respiratory distress, possibly pneumonia. He knelt beside the bed, placing a hand gently on Mikey's forehead, recoiling slightly at the intense heat radiating from the small boy's skin. Mikey's eyes fluttered open briefly, unfocused, and clouded with fever. "We need to get him help, Eliza," Arthur stated quietly, but with absolute certainty. "Proper medical help. He needs a doctor, maybe even the hospital." "But Mom said—" Eliza started, her voice choked with fear. "We don't have insurance, right? Now, she lost her old job, the one with benefits. The diner job barely covers rent and food. She said we couldn't afford to get sick." "We'll worry about the cost later," Arthur interrupted firmly, meeting Eliza's frightened gaze. "Right now, Mikey's health is the only thing that matters. There are programs, hospital charity care. We will figure it out. But he needs help now." Reached for his own cell phone, the reliable old flip phone he kept primarily for emergencies. "I'm going to call 911. Eliza didn't protest this time, just watched with wide, anxious eyes as Arthur quickly explained the situation to the dispatcher. The sick child, the respiratory distress, the blizzard conditions, the address. He relayed the dispatcher's instructions to Eliza. Unlock the front door again, turn on any outside lights, clear a path if possible. While Eliza hurried downstairs, Arthur stayed with Mikey, speaking softly to the little boy, smoothing his hair back from his feverish forehead, murmuring reassurances. He took off his own thick wool coat and gently draped it over the thin blankets covering Mikey, hoping to offer some extra warmth. He felt clumsy, inadequate, wishing he had professional, medical training. His role now was simply to be a calm presence, a steady anchor in this frightening storm. Within what felt like both an eternity and mere minutes, the flashing red and blue lights of an ambulance cut through the swirling snow outside, followed. Closely by a police cruiser, 2 paramedics bundled against the storm entered the house, bringing with them an air of calm competence that immediately eased some of the tension. They worked quickly, assessing Mikey, administering oxygen, taking vital signs, their movements efficient and professional. A police officer, a young woman with kind eyes, spoke gently with Eliza downstairs, getting details about their mother, contact numbers, the situation. Arthur explained how he had found them. The officer nodded understandingly, her expression sympathetic. "We'll keep trying the mother's number and check with her workplace," she assured them. "In the meantime, we'll need to notify social services, just to ensure support is in place for you both once he's treated." Eliza looked terrified at the mention of social services, but Arthur put a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's okay, Eliza," he murmured. "They're here to help families, especially in situations like this. It doesn't mean anything bad." He hoped he was right. Soon, the paramedics were carefully carrying Mikey, wrapped snugly in blankets and receiving oxygen down the narrow stairs on a portable stretcher. Eliza hovered nearby, her eyes fixed on her little brother, her face pale with worry. Mikey was conscious but listless, his breathing still labored but slightly eased by the oxygen mask. "We're taking him to Maine Medical Center," one of the paramedics told Arthur and the officer. "He definitely needs assessment for pneumonia or severe bronchitis." He glanced at Eliza. "Are you riding with him, honey?" Eliza looked torn, glancing back towards the empty house, then at her brother. "My mom." "We'll handle contacting your mother," the police officer said gently. "You should go with your brother. Mr. Harrison, are you able to accompany her? Provide support?" Arthur didn't hesitate. "Of course," he said immediately. "I'll come along." He knew he couldn't leave Eliza to face this alone. The ride to the hospital in the back of the ambulance was surreal. The storm raged outside, rocking the vehicle, the sirens cutting through the blizzard's roar. Inside, the paramedics worked quietly on Mikey, monitoring his vitals. Eliza sat huddled on the bench seat, clutching the yellow mitten tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on her brother's small face. Arthur sat beside her, offering a silent, steady presence, occasionally giving her shoulder a reassuring squeeze. At the hospital's emergency department, a whirlwind of activity ensued. Mikey was whisked away for tests and treatment. Eliza, looking small and lost amidst the bright lights and controlled chaos, clung to Arthur's sleeve. He stayed with her, helping her answer the admitting nurse's questions, providing what little information he knew, sitting beside her in the stark waiting area. As they waited for news, he finally understood Eliza's library ritual. It wasn't just a warm place to wait. It was likely the only quiet, safe space she had to herself for a few hours each day. A place where she could try to do her homework, escape into her drawings, or simply sit with the weight of her responsibilities. Without interruption, while knowing her brother was relatively safe, or so she likely hoped, at home until their mother returned from work late at night. The notebook wasn't just for homework. It was probably her journal, her sketchbook, her confidant. The library was her sanctuary. Hours passed. Finally, a doctor emerged, looking tired but reassuring. "He has a pretty severe case of pneumonia," the doctor explained to Eliza and Arthur. "But we started him on strong antibiotics and respiratory support. He's responding well, but he'll need to stay in the hospital for several days, maybe longer." He looked kindly at Eliza. "Your brother is lucky you got him here when you did," and he added, glancing at Arthur, "lucky you had help getting through the storm." Just then, Eliza's mother, Marianne Miller, the name finally learned through hospital registration, rushed into the waiting area, her face frantic with worry, still wearing her work uniform. The police had finally reached her. Seeing Eliza safe and hearing that Mikey was being treated, she burst into tears, pulling Eliza into a fierce hug. Arthur quietly explained the situation, the unlocked door, the severity of Mikey's condition. Marianne listened, her expression shifting from panic to exhaustion to overwhelming gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered to Arthur, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you for finding them, for helping them. I was so worried about the storm, about getting home. I didn't know how bad he was." Arthur simply nodded, understanding the impossible choices the woman faced. "Eliza was very brave taking care of him," he said softly. Mikey made a full recovery after a lengthy hospital stay. The intervention by social services, prompted by the emergency, connected Marianne Miller with resources she hadn't known existed: rent assistance, food bank access, subsidized childcare options, and enrollment in a job training program that eventually led her to a more stable position with daytime hours and health benefits. Arthur became a quiet, steady presence in the Millers' lives. He visited Mikey and Eliza regularly, sometimes bringing books from the library. On loan, he always specified, though he never expected them back. Other times just offering quiet company or helping Eliza with her homework. He learned that Eliza's notebook was indeed filled with beautiful, intricate drawings, revealing a hidden talent and a rich inner world. He encouraged her art, providing her with proper sketchpads and pencils from his own modest funds. Eliza slowly began to trust Arthur. She started talking more, sharing small details about her life, her worries, her dreams. She still came to the library almost every afternoon after school, but now she didn't always retreat to the back corner. Sometimes she'd sit at one of the main tables working on her drawings. Sometimes she'd even browse the shelves, hesitantly selecting a book on art history or a fantasy novel. She even checked out her first book, using the library card Arthur helped her mother sign her up for, a milestone that brought a quiet smile to Arthur's face. One sunny afternoon the following spring, Eliza approached the circulation desk where Arthur was stamping due dates. She held out a carefully wrapped package. "This is for you, Mr. Harrison," she said shyly, but her eyes met his directly, no longer filled with fear but with warmth. Arthur opened it carefully. Inside was Eliza's spiral notebook, the one she had guarded so fiercely. But now, its pages were filled not just with her drawings, but with a story she had written and illustrated herself. A story about a kind librarian, a hidden mitten, and finding help during a storm. On the last page, she had written, "Thank you for following, May." Tears welled in Arthur Harrison's eyes as he looked at the heartfelt gift. He realized that following Eliza into the storm hadn't just changed her life and Mikey's. It had profoundly changed his own. The quiet, solitary librarian had found an unexpected connection, a renewed sense of purpose, all sparked by a silent girl in a purple jacket and a lost yellow mitten. The library felt less like a sanctuary for just him now, and more like a place where different kinds of light could find their way in. Arthur's quiet observation and brave decision made all the difference. What did you think of his actions? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story warmed your heart, please give it a like and don't forget to subscribe for more touching tales of kindness, courage, and the connections that save us. Thank you for watching.